stage. This is the second round of our Wheel of Perspectives exploration of the status of states. I'm joined today by Bonnitta Roy, Tom Murray, Michael Schwartz, David Long, and Layman Pascal. To get us going, and for the sake of our viewers, and really because Bonnie and Layman set me up to this, I'd like to start with a summary of what I took away from the first round, where each of you shared your particular takes on the nature and function of states and the value of state training. I won't focus here on what individuals said, but just give a global overview of some of the major confluences and points of divergence that I noticed over the course of your talks. Pretty uniformly, there was recognition of the value of the original states distinction in Wilberian transpersonal and integral theory to make some important differentiations, namely to differentiate spiritual or transpersonal states from developmental stages and psychological shadow in order to make better sense of the territory in spiritual circles that we encounter among adepts, etc., where there's often a disparity between realization of spiritual states and cognitive or emotional development or mature ethical expression. There's also a shared recognition of the importance of formulating a generalized theory of states, distinct from or more fundamental than the usual focus on states as special spiritual experiences. Participants argued both for a more generalized definition of states of consciousness as inclusive of spiritual experiences, but also of basically any experiential domain, not limited to so-called natural states or their traditional waking correlates. And there was also emphasis on developing a more generalized definition of states that's applicable across all quadrants, so not just limited to consciousness. There was less uniformity in how states themselves were defined. Some defined states as basically moments of experience, which can be qualitatively distinguished and which involve a changing mix or a toggling of what is online and what's offline, what's within awareness and outside of awareness. Others approach states more as ontological or as onto-epistemological domains, for instance, describing the four natural states, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and non-dual, respectively as the material, qualitative, syntactical, and blended dimensions of being, or as the quasi-Lacanian domains of the real, imaginary, symbolic, and transcendent. This relates to bigger differences I noticed among the presentations. Some of you stayed very experience near and emphasized phenomenology without necessary reference to metaphysics, and others ventured more into abstraction and were more metaphysical in your discussions. Across most of the presentations, I also noticed acknowledgement of the desirability of a more naturalistic, scientifically informed, post-metaphysical understanding of states, whether drawing from cognitive neuroscience or quantum theory. There was an emphasis on not straying too far from what can be empirically verified. And related to that, there was also recognition of the importance of setting some epistemological boundaries, of not sliding too easily or uncritically from phenomenological experience into ontological claims about reality itself. So those are some primary takeaways that I had from listening to all of you. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about that and what other distinctions you'd like to make or commonalities that you noticed.
One thing I wrote down that is just a reiteration of what you said, Bruce, was just to make sure we're talking about states or state experience. I think that a lot of the discourse gets into conflict or tension because someone's talking about states and someone may be talking about state experiences. And I think most of us spend more time talking about state experiences, but if we get into the conversation, just notice when we do, if we do, slip into the context of states versus state experience. So, for example, by metaphor, analogy, I can see myself switching from first person, second person, or third person perspective. That's the experience I'm having as I navigate perspectives. But I wouldn't say I'm accessing a first person perspective state. You know, I'm not accessing a first person perspective. That would be to think of it as a perspective out there. So their states are more like ontological fields or patterns or thing-like things. And then there's an experience. I mean, I can have the experience of being in a joyful state. And that's all I mean, nothing really fancy.
Yeah, I think the term state experience is a good one for making that distinction. I usually do it the other way and say state domain when I'm trying to talk about an ontological style as opposed to an experience. But state domain and state experience works pretty good for me to make that distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. It would have been good to have Lex here because I would have liked to ask him about that, because out of all of us, I think maybe he might be more prone to disagree with us on that. And I would have liked to have heard what he says about some of that stuff, because he's talking about things like accessing universal memory and stuff like that. So I don't really know where he's coming from on that. Does anyone have an idea about that or have anything to say about that?
I'm still chewing on the distinctions that Bonnie made, and clearly we can use different words for different things. So it's more important to talk about what the distinctions are without getting caught up in what we're naming them. But I want to ask Bonnie, you brought up first, second, third person perspective as a state experience. For me, there's a difference between, I guess you would say, the cognitive aspect of a state and the sort of embodied, almost you could call it a view. It's almost about perceptually what's turned on and off. And so I can be in an embodied way in a first person perspective, which means I can't take a second person perspective. I'm like fully in that. And then I can also be in a normal waking state of an adult and take different perspectives cognitively, but I feel like I'm still in the same state. So
Yes.
I'm just trying to parse out the two. And again, for me, we sort of strip the cognitive out and try to get more to that perceptual embodied place.
Yeah, you misunderstood what I meant. I was just using the perspectival language as a metaphor, like saying I can
Yeah.
have the experience of being in a perspective, but I wouldn't call that a state.
Right, but you're
Right.
calling it I'm still trying to get the distinction between state and state experience.
Okay,
So you said
yeah,
taking the different perspectives were different state experiences. To me, they might be different experiences, but not different. Yeah,
I'm just referencing the traditional tendency to say there are states you can access. They're out there, right?
yeah.
And I'm saying that that's different than talking about state experiences. And to me, the analogy is, as a metaphor or analogy, is to say there are perspectives out there that you can access, even if nobody has those perspectives, versus having the experience of taking a perspective. I wasn't so much trying to define what those differences were, but just to be aware when we're talking which one we mean. So like if nobody ever dreamt, would there be a dream state? I would say no. We just call it the dream state as a placeholder to abstract from all the times people actually experience dreaming. And
Yes.
the traditions and other people tend to talk about states as if they persist or are available or are reified or something. And I think that sometimes that method or that language game is useful, but we should just be cognizant when we've slid into one framework of language or the other. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right. And this is kind of one of the distinctions that I'm trying to make when I am reframing the states from a more an emergentist perspective. Like you're saying, it's not like I think that we're accessing like the Bardo realm or some kind of thing that's out there, some kind of dimension, that it's more like accessing your own interior dimensions of like archetypes and stuff like that. But yeah, those are like some of the different metaphysical perspectives that Bruce was describing around how we think about states. And that's kind of what you're saying, is that these kinds of states are like loose metaphorical ways of talking about what it means to be dreaming.
Yeah, but I don't even believe in the archetypal realm.
Right. Not like a
think
realm, but it's a metaphor. It's like talking about the noosphere. Metaphor is talking about different experiences or areas of understanding.
On the other hand, I am going to throw the sticky wicket in that any theory of states as experiential needs to account for the fact that there are entrained patterns. So the dream state seems to have a pattern, and this state seems to have a pattern. And we need to be able to account for that.
So I would propose some things, see how this lands, that kind of to get away from the ontological aspect of it for a moment, to say that there's a certain set of possible states that people can have, it's a very large set of possibilities, and that set of possibilities has different properties. And one of the properties has to do with how you consider the boundaries between self and world, and another property might be whether you have self-reflective, metacognitive access to your own state. There are all these different properties, and some of them seem to be more important for certain kinds of spiritual purposes or endeavors. In other words, you could take any set of important properties and cash out these categories that are only referenced because you thought that property was important. So when you look at the vast world of states and you come out with the classic Eastern states, that's because you're focusing on certain properties of states, and that kind of collapses it into 4 categories. When in fact, those aren't ontologically real categories. They A, point to what properties are important to you, and B, they point to the fact that our experience tends to group around a certain set of properties out of its infinite set. So it's not like a smooth distribution. It's like we're usually either awake or dreaming, but there's a place in between. And so when you put things into those categories, you miss what's in between. And the categories themselves are useful tools, but there's no ontological 4 states.
Can you give an example of what you mean by in between?
Yeah, that liminal place of waking up, when you're in between waking and dreaming. If we spent a lot more time in that state, it might show up as a 5th state just because it's more prominent and highlighted in life.
Well, I would also say that from my definition, when you're dreaming, you don't usually have access to your body, right? So you have like body paralysis and stuff. But in meditation, you can also have body drop. You have no access to your body, but you're not dreaming. So there's many different combinations of what dreaming is and what meditation body drop. You're completely aware, your perceptual system's online, but your body's dropped. In dreaming, your body is dropped and other things. So there's all kinds of combinations that can happen in these
right.
experiences.
So even dream state is kind of too broad of a category, because a lot of times we're doing like imaginal type meditations or whatever, and we could be closing our eyes and visualizing things, but like you're saying, we're still basically awake and we have access to our body. And
perfect. So you might be dreaming and the body drop is not happening and your perceptual system's on. So there's many combinations of what could be happening in the experience.
That's a good distinction. Yeah. So it's more of like a blanket term for a bunch of different kinds of experiences than like a very useful particular kind of category or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, people can do art, and you might have this experience, and you're like painting on the canvas. It's very dreamlike. It's just like you're interacting with something, but it's not a dream.
Flow state can be like a different state than the waking state, but it is technically in the waking state or whatever.
Exactly. So all these things, we need to parse more variables. That's all.
Yeah. And I think kind of what we've done here is talk about how we can see these states through the perspective of different metaphysical lenses, that we're still kind of trying to figure out a good way to talk about it. And it seems like Tom pointed us in the direction of the importance of these states and how we see them and how we value them in relation to different projects given our metaphysical assumptions, right?
Yeah, there is no real ontological states out there. Each categorization scheme is a tool that we bring to bear. And I think what's important there is you don't want a vocabulary that's got 12 parts. If you got one that has 4 parts, that's more usable and more understandable and more shareable. So I think the important thing is when you use a particular classification scheme, it's got 4 parts that you kind of know on the side that you are ignoring everything that falls in between or outside of those 4 categories. And if everybody can agree to that, then you can move forward with the conversation. But every once in a while you bump into something, an example state that's in between, and that's when it's good to highlight the fact that you are using a particular vocabulary.
I think that's very useful. That's a really good set of distinctions, it seems to me.
So having started that conversation, I'd like to move this into like some meat, and that is like, why do these things matter? Like, why does it matter that we talk about states? I think people know why it matters that we talk about stages of development, and the world gets complex, so we have to get more complex and blah, blah, blah. But why does it matter that we train ourselves to be aware of states and train ourselves in states? Why does it matter that we dream? And why does it matter that we know we dream? And why does it matter that we get into mindfulness states where we drop certain things and highlight other things? And why does it matter? So maybe Michael and Layman can talk about this. What's the big deal? Why does it matter?
Yeah, I wanted to step in since Michael and Layman hadn't spoken yet and ask if there was anything that they wanted to add in relationship to the initial sharing. But then also, yes, I do want to move towards our first question, which is very much in line with exactly what Bonnie's asking for. So before we move into that, just briefly, is there anything in relationship to what was just discussed, Michael or Layman, that you would like to add?
I think these are very 19th century issues, very modern issues, and they really go to the relationship of knowing to being and the loss of confidence in being part of an inherently meaningful universe. It's a big topic, but I think states really become a crux for human beings to explore where there are realms that have something to do with these expanded states or not. So I have a lot more I could say on it, but that would be my concern, is that inheriting this disenchanted universe, which has all kinds of implications for identity, how we relate to one another, where we access meaning, where we seek the status of truth, and how we have conditions of truth. It's a really important topic and is often underground. It's often unconscious or sort of a pre-understanding that people carry in various ways. I think states, accessing these states, certain kinds of states, and what degree they're intersubjective, interobjective, what are the causalities involved with them, what degree they go beyond into something like a realm. We move from epistemology to something like ontology. I think that's the crux of it and why they're really important to really explore.
I like the distinctions that were being made before, and I feel very attentive to something like a difference between immersion and just focusing on a facet of reality that comes up. There's a difference between being in a state, seemingly, where it comes around you, like I'm in dreams, versus I'm picking out that element of my blended experience that I might associate with particular dreamlike qualities. For me, it seems like all of the 4 sets of types of fundamental things you need to have for reality are omnipresent all the time. And sometimes it feels like you go inside them in various different ways and in various different combinations. And when we say, just maybe for people watching and listening, if we say it's not like there really are these other realms, that also means the gross realm. It's not like we're saying there is just the gross realm and these other ones are metaphorical. This physical one is of that same nature. It's a partial interpretation of what's going on that is a much more complex affair. And so why is that meaningful? Why am I interested in that? Well, the higher order answers, I just love it, and I love the people that are involved in it. But the lower order answers are something like, I feel that any kind of well-being depends on the fidelity of how well we personally, socially, and even technologically map to reality. And if reality consists of these sets of experiences, these other forms of experience, then they have to be included in the map, or the map will consistently fail to provide richness of experience. I think Whitehead said something like, if reality is only that which we put together based on the waking experiences of sober Europeans, it's going to be a very narrow model. That there's no reason not to sample every kind of state in order to form a coherent image of what reality consists of. It doesn't seem like there's a fundamental justification for sampling only one type of state experience in order to form a reality model. And we seem to have done that, at least publicly, over the last few hundred years, even though in people's actual lives, they never stopped having an enchanted experience. Personally, I feel like it's a significant driver of beingness and overall development, even development through stages, to produce and reproduce balanced and harmonized experiences between different subjective subsets of your possibilities. Those subsets might be quadrants, they might be states, they might be different lines of intelligence, or however one we language those things. But I think that the states are a very common, very accessible subdivision of our subjective experience, and that subjective experiences have to be traversed and brought together and balanced reasonably well in order for our overall sense of being to come forth and our overall development to move ahead at its optimal rate.
And I'd like to ask if anyone else were looking at this question together and nodding to what Bonnie had said before and what Layman has just started talking about. What is personally meaningful to you about this exploration, and where would you like to see this exploration unfolding for our respective communities? And just in the interest of our time, for anyone responding, let's try to keep it within about 3 minutes and just get a sampling of views for how you look at this and what's important for you.
This is moving away from the sort of Eastern model of states and just the more general experiential field. The states that seem important to me and for people to create discernment around are things like curiosity and love and state of like tension or contraction, dissociation between yourself, between you and the world, between you and others, intersubjective, empathic flow, and then the sort of imaginal state that I guess that one's more like a dream state where judgment and certain kinds of processing fall away. So for me, when I think of like what kinds of conversations about states are important for my health and well-being and the health and well-being of the world, there are things like that. How do we identify when this is happening or that's happening, and how do we support the kinds of states that are healthy for all of us? And I'll add as a teaser to see what other people think is that a lot of the states that we're talking about and the ones that I think are important are about letting go of certain aspects of waking. It almost seems to me that it's about turning off certain systems so that we can live more fully within other more foundational parts of the mind. Is kind of an ablative model of a lot of these states, which is related to Bonnie's developmental concept of reducing complexity.
I guess I'll jump in here next. I think states really matter because getting it right matters. Understanding what's going on in the world matters. If we don't understand what's up with states, then we don't understand what's up with ontology. In the ways that I see a lot of people getting it wrong, almost in every way has to do with an interpretation or a translation of their experience. So I think there are a lot of people who have a lot of good intentions and they want to do good in the world. They want to be a good person. They want to live for a higher purpose. They want to be spiritual. They want to appreciate reality and understand what's going on. And that's states, waking states, spiritual practice. What does it mean to dream? All these kind of questions. This stuff is super important. Like a lot of philosophy and these ideas, they seem really pie in the sky to people. Like, why does it matter? You know, like, we disagree about these things. Like, who cares? Can't we all just get along? You know, and there's something right about that, but at the same time, it really does matter. It not only matters to us as individuals, but if we're integralists talking about how we're going to birth a new integral age and create new systems to where we're going to do it better, that assumes that we think that we know well enough to be able to create something healthy for other people. And that means getting it right. So I think it's really important, not just for our own personal daily lives and feeling like we're aligned with reality and that we're living a moral and ethical life, but it matters if we're thinking about trying to scale these ideas and pass them on to other people. There's a certain amount of social responsibility as well as personal responsibility when it comes to these things, I think. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Bonnitta thinks, why she thinks it's so important. What, you're going to be quiet about it?
So I think it matters because states are powerful experiences. Unusual states, even ordinary kind of state experiences, have a powerful signature on the human experience. And they're part of spiritual technologies. And I've just seen state experience being used and abused for, spiritual technologies and for abusive and hierarchical and all kinds of, like, for people to make money. This has been going on for millennia, right? It's become, there's been a marketplace for state technologies for millennia. So I think that's the negative aspect of it. But I think that it's because they're powerful, and the ability to create state experiences in people is a very, very powerful transmission. And I think we need to understand them for the human potential that they are, understand that, they're part of the human evolutionary potential of the core self, I think, and treat them as that, treat them as any other human potential and not as subject to someone who's supposedly closer to God, So I always teach my students, like, if everybody was disembodied in the dream state, and then there was a few rare people that came back and said, no, like there's a real world, and you can taste things, and you have a body, and there's objects. These would be the gurus of that environment. So I think states are very powerful. But even ordinary states are very powerful and sacred. We end up sometimes thinking like, it's just ordinary, but how can we make meaning together? Like, how can I be on this screen with you and across like transmission? This is tremendously fantastic, even an ordinary experience. So that's the caveat. But I think also once we get over that and stop using them as some kind of a transactional spiritual technology, I think there's something about how many degrees of freedom that states allow. The more states you can access, just like the more perspectives. I always say that states are the view from which the perspectives arise. You become less habituated to conditioned ways of looking at the world. More of reality is allowed in. Reality becomes more and more sacred, more and more mysterious, more numinous. There are states that can liberate ordinary perception. So in certain ordinary states, perception is actually quite limited. And even though perception is seen as part of the waking state, like in a different state experience, you can see that actually the capacity is much greater than the limited capacity. So I think that there's more degrees of freedom and much more fullness in our ordinary capacity when we enter different states, and a much larger view of who we are and our role in the cosmology. And I think that is also liberating. So that's kind of my answer ad hoc. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, I really like that answer. And I really like what you said about appreciating ordinary states and not just the heightened states, because life is a blessing as it is. So I think that's great.
The paradox is, in most cases, you need an altered state to appreciate the ordinary state. That's the paradox.
That's a good point.
Even though I'm a moderator here, I'm tempted to jump in and say something a little bit. In my transpersonal psychology classes, I think modern Western culture tends to be somewhat state impoverished. I like to joke to students that in our culture, we've mastered 4 states, which are waking, dreaming, drunk, and high. And most people don't venture very far out of that. But if you immerse yourself in other cultures, you can see that there are people in other cultures that actually have great facility in navigating a whole range of states and affecting different kinds of things from within those states in terms of accessing creativity, heightening their own sensual acuity, performing healing, doing psychological and spiritual work on others. And the shamanic cultures and some of the other contemplative cultures have really great facility with navigating a whole range of states. And whether we take on board some of the metaphysical implications of some of those states or not, I think transpersonalists have done us the benefit, starting with Jung possibly and others going forward, showing us just the transformative potential of state access. One, to shift perspectives, to disembed us from our conditioned perspective, to open up new horizons of possibility, to enlarge the scope of the self and its activities, to actually allow for a psycho-emotional processing that can move through the system in a more rapid and coherent way than just verbal processing of the analysis on the couch. So there's just a whole range of things there that I think, we need to pay attention to the gifts of states for helping us arrive at deeper states of personal integration, bringing more of our capacities on board, and actually just the perspectival gift of disembedding us from presupposed world spaces to open up horizons of possibility for us.
Well, Bruce, I really appreciated that. And echoing, in these cultures that are not so allergic to some of these other more expansive states that are available, it's not just how we're tending to frame it as personal, subjective, and so on. Even if you bracket the metaphysics in any strong sense, the ability for groups to access these states have all quadrant implications. There are causalities that occur, there are abilities to have subjectivities touch subjectivities in these higher states. Energies touch one another. Healings occur. So I wonder, even the way we in the West frame this, in fact, in a course called Transpersonal Psychology, we have a strong bias to framing states in terms of the individual, in terms of the personal, in terms of experience, and might learn something from traditional cultures in that there might be something in these expanded states that are more intersubjective, interobjective, and have causal implications, which then begins to point to something beyond ourselves that these states involve. That would be my curiosity, and is my curiosity.
Yeah, so I'm going to agree that there's a causal implication. State experiences are causally effective or have causal implications. Let's say that. Now, this is tricky territory, Michael. But yeah, I would say that's a firm commitment.
Just for clarification here, what do we mean by causal in this context?
An ability to affect our experience or collective experience or shared experience in some way.
So you mean like cause and effect kind of a thing?
Yeah, like causative mechanisms.
Yeah.
What if I can go into a deep state with another person and be able to affect a transformation in that person or generate knowledge that might not otherwise be available traditionally? And that knowledge actually ends up having some kind of efficacy in the ways we act. That begins to suggest, even if it's a probability, rather than kind of a mechanical billiard ball, that we're dealing with something that is beyond this notion of subjective and something personal. And the way that these have been framed in the history of the 19th century, William James and other people, what really happened to these. I don't think you can make a quick leap into some strong ontological realm claim. I think it's a careful matter of going from the kinds of evidence that are both subjective and intersubjective and repeatable. But then there's something, philosophy calls transcendental arguments about what does the world need to look like for this to be occurring? Where do the causal mechanisms have to lie? And certain sectors of consciousness studies actually do this kind of philosophical work in a very careful way. And I would share a kind of commitment along those lines of exploring what degree we can move from these subjective experiences, states, to something about reality more broadly. That would be my curiosity. And in fact, I think it's really inherent in the opening of SES. And that's another story. Wilbur's invocation of Schelling has everything to do with it.
And I would say, I'm going to bring it down to simpler level, but it should resonate with what you said. So for example, if someone is paranoid schizophrenic, that's a state. We can call that a state. It has actual causal implications because he thinks that his paranoia is actually arising in the other, and then he takes out a gun and he shoots them. So it's causally effective. That state is causally effective. It actually acts in the world. And so I think the state experiencers, or being in certain states of awareness or these other states, change behavior at the level that is just ordinary causation. So that's kind of the lowest bar of thinking about causation. But I think there's other levels of how that happens. The whole area of causation is really fascinating. I'm writing about numinous causation. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And when you enter that way of living, it feels like a different state. Like agency is everywhere, it's omnipresent in all directions. And so you start not only making big actions in the world, like shooting someone because you're paranoid, but you begin to notice how things work, and then you make small movements in concert with the way things work. So that's what I would call true causal, that things just work a certain way. And you just make small movements in concert with the way they seem to be working already. And that's a kind of different relationship to causality that I'm just kind of hinting at because it's like a big thing and it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But I would say that certain state experiences, not any one particular state experience, but if you go through a lot of state experiences, they deconstruct a lot of what you typically think is cause and effect, and they open up the possibility for relating to causality in a different way.
Can you give an example of that? Wouldn't that be like a translation of the experience? What's a good example of that?
There are ordinary experiences where we say, if this, then that. right? And this kind of language, this kind of causality seems to be breaking down, because if I go to school and get good grades, then I'll have a good job. This is all starting to break down. The whole ability to make if-then statements is becoming unreliable. So that's one thing. And then there's a second order of causality where you say, well, it's all emergent and uncertain, and there's a lot less causal links than we think. Okay, so that's the second level. That's all has to do with complexity science. And the third is, what if there's no if and no then?
How does that work?
How does causality
Because
work if there's no if and no then?
how are we coming to the conclusion that there is no if and no then? Like, for example, the
Well,
first thing you
that's
said.
a state experience.
Well, no, wouldn't that be a translation of a state experience?
No, it's a state experience. You can have the experience of no if and no then.
Well, just having the
Yeah,
experience of it doesn't necessarily make it true, right? Because I can have the experience of Jesus in my heart, but that doesn't really mean that it's Jesus
No,
in
but
my
it
heart.
implicates my whole being in the world, and that's causally effective. Just like the paranoid schizophrenic implicates their being in the world, and that's causally effective.
I think a lot of the states that we're interested in are just examples of things dropping away. And so we experience a more expansive set of possibilities and perceptions and intuitions. And then I think what can happen with people is then like something fresh and new comes up from that space and they reify it. So it's one thing to drop the planning cognitive mind and drop certain kinds of beliefs and drop into even a space where there's no time or space and no if and then. And it's another to have something come up within that space and then hold on to it like, now I have the answer. So for me, that's an important distinction. Like there's something about dropping into these spaces, including the intersubjective space, and allowing fresh new things to arise. Then there's a trick, I think, which is a more kind of evolved or postmodern skill, which is not to let things reify or turn into fixed categories or beliefs from there, but to stay in the flow of it. And I guess it's related to what you were saying, Bonnie, if you're just allowing your knowledge to sense and respond and do this incremental, you're kind of letting the unconscious do the thinking instead of the conscious rational mind in a sense.
My concern about this is that what often happens with spiritual experience is that we're taught some spiritual teachings and then we're initiated into an spiritual experience, and then we understand that experience in the light of the spiritual teachings that we've been taught. And part of that is that we're taught that it's like this kind of pure experience or this pure knowing, when in fact, even that is part of the circular reasoning of this conditioned experience. So we come out of an experience and we describe our experience, but we describe our experience in the light of what we think about it already. So like, this is like where I think it's interesting, like the Wilbur-Combs matrix. Like, for example, Tom, you were talking about in your talk about how practicing states, these kinds of habits that you can work on and practice, that eventually they can become like structures of consciousness that you can build up. But I'm interested in this because that's like saying that states become stages. But when the Wilbur-Combs matrix, it almost seems like Wilbur's kind of contradicting himself, because there he's saying that we're translating and we're understanding whatever state that we have from whatever stage that we have. You know, like we only have whatever tools that we're working with at the moment to be able to translate our experience. And so I feel like there's either some confusion or some kind of contradiction even within what Wilbur is saying around some of this stuff. What do you think about this, Layman? I know you brought up the Wilbur-Combs matrix in your talk. You were the only one who really mentioned it.
For me, that was a really important move from Wilbur to even partially, because like you say, he does seem to vacillate on this subject, but to move away from the traditional hierarchical notion of the states, in which some of them are more fundamental than others. And that just doesn't seem to be the result of my experiencing or my thinking on the subject. I really like the Wilbur-Combs lattice in the sense of putting them all on the same playing field and then bringing in this element of interpretation, like you say. There's variations in interpretation, like the example you gave of having Jesus in your heart. That's heavily laden with an interpretation, but the idea of not seeing a standard if-then logical sequence, for me, is a little bit different. It's like trying to define the logic of a particular set of states. Like I might say that what I mean by the four states is something like four different kinds of logics of worlds, where the gross realm is the set of sequential logics. Right, Einstein's proposition that there isn't really any simultaneity that characterizes physical energy transitions. So there's an if-then, there's a sequential logic to the entire gross realm. You might say that characterizes the gross realm.
So it's not like a claim about the truth of it, it's more of an experiential description, is what you're saying.
Yeah, so some things people are saying are going to be closer to the experiential architectural description side, and others ones will be closer to something that's embedded in their personal and cultural interpretive reference, which is either very quick or already embedded in their perception of the experiences they have in other states.
I think that's a good distinction. It's hard because I think a lot of times people are so embedded in their worldview that they take it for granted, and they have this kind of like naive realism. Like they think that whatever experience they had is some kind of pure experience, uncolored by all of the cultural conditioning that they've received. And I don't really think that you can get like outside of your own perspective to be able to translate any experience. And so that's part of the problem of this whole situation.
Layman, I was really struck by your statement, these different states of different logics. And I think I heard something along those lines in your talk, I'm remembering. And I couldn't agree more that certain subtle states, even when collectively enacted, have different time spaces than, say, the so-called gross realm. And then certain kinds of low causal spaces work differently. And you might say there are different logoi to the different states, both and understood not just subjectively, but all quadrant. And then the interesting thing, again, I'm echoing you about this interpenetration and how they work, is what happens with these different logics of these different states, these different space-times, these different rhythmic, even one that Bonnie's pointing to, the suspension of causality in certain quote-unquote non-dual states. This really pushes the neo-Kantian character of developmental psychology, where the sense of the world is structured through different schema historically. This is what Piaget was talking about, including time and space. I think this extends into these states, beyond traditional state structures, into states. And for me, and actually a group that lives here in Augusta, this is one of our curiosities. I mean, this is one of the things we're actually exploring, is what is that? What are the realities of it, if any? And so I really appreciate what you're saying, and maybe I'm understanding a little better maybe where you're coming from, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to highlight, now we have a working definition of states versus state experience, because it's just like a worldview. We understand a worldview is enacted by people who hold that, and we can think of worldview. That's that worldview. And so that's that state. And I would say that a worldview is formed by certain assumptions and cultures and language and this and that. It's very high, kind of sophisticated part of being human. But a state is bounded by things like much more basic things, like assumptions of a causality, assumption of agency, assumption of relations in reality, assumptions and perceptions, not the idea of perceptions, but literally what you see in a worldview. Like if you have a certain worldview and you see Black people, you see threat, right? Those are coupled. But in a state, these are perceptual realms that are different. Like what you actually see is different in different states. So I would say that states, if you think of them as worldviews that you can enter or be bounded by, this is a good modern definition of a state that is decoupled from the experience itself, that people can enter a worldview in the same way they can enter a state, or vice versa. So yeah, that's a good analogy.
And so like the difference between the Jesus in my heart interpretation is that's going to be specific to a particular culture and a particular tradition, whereas a description of like a particular kind of state is going to be universal to almost anybody, no matter who you put. Like we would all agree that there are Black people, regardless of what different people might think of them. In the waking state, there are Black people.
I'm taking that slightly differently. To say, what I hear is like belief that you have Jesus in your heart is part of your worldview, but then there's something we're calling a state, which is what you have in common. When you have Jesus in your heart and somebody else has Buddha in their heart and someone else just has love in their heart, there's something in common. It's more fundamental than the worldview set of beliefs and interpretations that is shared, and it's more biophysical, basic, perceptual, and that's what we're calling the state.
Right, right. So there's a difference between the universal description of the character of what's going on versus like a particular translation or something.
Yeah, and that's essentially pointing to the Wilbur-Combs distinction, that you can have this experience of unbounded love or empathy, and there are many ways to interpret that state that is in common.
I've been thinking about how I feel about Tom's ablative hypothesis, but I think Bruce might want to keep us on track here.
What's ablative? What's that mean?
It means to remove, so that the proposition was that, basically in Western culture, we've developed all this cognitive or thinking, we're way outbalanced in terms of a certain part of the mind that's always over functioning. And if you strip that away and you find different techniques for putting it aside, you have access to other kinds of experiences that we're talking about. And the more that you strip away, maybe that we could call it the deeper states you have access to. I would just say that I think what's important about these states is that they're ways of unknowing rather than ways of knowing. They're modes of unknowing. And each mode is a place where you unknow more or a different kind of thing, which is the assumption, cognitive or just embodied perceptual assumption that you used to have. So
can you give an example of that?
If I find a way to not only stop thinking that we're separate, but to experience that we're not separate, and I fall in love with you in a moment, it's ablative. Something is stripped away. At some point in childhood, time and space were constructed as part of my experience. But if I find a way to put that aside and visit a place before time and space was constructed, then I'm in a timeless, spaceless realm. They're all kind of ablative steps that open up
I'm not convinced
possibilities.
one way or another, whether it's a removal or an addition or both. But we better check.
I think the point here is that he loves me, and I love you, Tom.
Thank you, David.
Well, there you go, causally effective. I think also there's a possibility of ablation and then building up new knowledge, right? So insight.
Exactly. Right.
So we have knowledge built up on certain kind of basic shared state, waking state, and then you can actually, if you had a community of practice, you could actually build new knowledge on new states based upon starting over at some kind of lower juncture or something like that.
This is stuff I borrowed from Bonnie's theoretical work, and she calls it insight practice. So it's basically the idea, if you ablate down and open up a space of possibilities, then insights emerge from that open space. And then you can take the next step, which is more of a constructive step, and you can create new meaning and new understanding from that space. But the important first step is the ablative step.
This constructive step, one of the things you want to avoid is interpretation. What you do instead is experiment. You say, like, I had this experience once of driving down to my horses, and I don't know what overcame me, but literally I no longer saw them eating the grass. I saw the grass growing horses. It was literally a complete reframe of reality. And I had to shake myself out of it, because if you saw, ultimately you would see the soil growing grasses. You know what that feels like. So the soil was growing the horses. All right. So then I decided not to interpret that, but to experiment. What if I acted on that way of thinking? And so that's different than interpreting. It's just to say, okay, I had this gift. There's a different way of looking at things. And so there's more effort into it, right? So I have to say, no, I'm not going to do that because that's in this interpretation. I'm going to switch it as if it's that interpretation. I think that's how you can explore these things without getting into some kind of metaphysical interpretation. You just say, well, what if I structure my decision and my behavior based upon this way of looking at things versus the other? Then what unfolds from there? And those all are actually quite interesting results.
I agree with that. I just wouldn't necessarily think of it as a removal. I think it's equally plausible to think of it as the addition of a counterforce.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple comments on that. And I think, again, Bonnie said something that kind of moves us in the next direction. First, just echoing on what Michael and Layman were talking about, I think it was Charles Tart who made a distinction that we need state-specific sciences because different states have their own logics and worlds and time-space configurations and modes of causality. And if we just try to import basically gross waking state assumptions into other states, we may be unnecessarily limiting ourselves. And he didn't have a lot of really, that I could see, very concrete proposals yet, but overall his intuition was that we need to find different state-specific modes of engaging with and exploring the experiential worlds to see what we can learn from them and not to just collapse them all down to a single interpretive frame based on gross waking consciousness, if we want to use Wilber's language. And also about the question of ablation and removing or addition. One way I think about it is kind of a not doing exercise, and that could be interpreted both as a removing but also as an addition, in terms of you do something that is basically not what you normally do. You stop doing something that you habitually do and you flip experience in some way, or flip your approach to experience that allows other things to open up. And Michael Washburn gives some good examples there in terms of just how mindfulness can work. Simple receptive attention basically disengages from the typical ego modes of direction and ordering of experience. And as you kind of let go of the habitual impulses of thought identified perceiver, all of the activity that it normally does is thrown into relief. That's our initial discovery of how busy our minds are. But as we don't entertain that, and as we disengage from that, we begin to see disclosed domains of experience, subliminal threshold type experiences, and other kinds of experiences that are normally obscured by our habitual thought identified way of navigating the world. And so there is a kind of stop put on certain behaviors or certain modes of engagement. And as we allow that to subside, other dimensions of experience are opened up to us. Michael Washburn talks about how we can move into deeper layers of the unconscious in that way. But I think making it broader in terms of Castaneda or TSK or various other contemplative approaches, just experimenting, identifying the way that we hold experience and choosing to deselect that and to entertain different modes of using our senses, different patterns of breathing, different ways of holding attention, that can really begin to open up new territory. And so to me, as Layman is suggesting, there is something that seems to be both ablative and additive at the same time, in that there's a creative element to that decision. So in talking about that, I'd like to just open it up, since we are talking about this mode of experimenting. For you, how does state practice, state experimentation, training show up in your life? What do you engage in? What's important for you in terms of your own practice, experimentation, learning in this area?
I think one of the things that's important for me is a kind of confidence that you get from certain forms of intense seeming state experience, that there are states that can seem to be terrifying in the transition into those states because of the seeming difference that you're entering and the shift in your sense of self and the configuration of elements you're using to anchor your experience. And going to and from those states, however many times you do it, can give you a tremendous sense of adaptable confidence in general in life, I think. You're less concerned. There may be a generalized background anxiety that people experience about the possibility of intense state transitions. And being able to successfully navigate some of those transitions can really open up a very relaxed, centered, confident thing in yourself. It's very pleasurable. So that's on the one side, is what I think a real gain is from having even dramatic state change experiences. I would probably say, although the description is debatable, that I do something like a subtle energy flow meditation each morning in order to get myself going to make this unit seem something like the one that I want to inhabit. And then my favorite ones tend to be koanic, whether it's working with koans or with a generalized structure that I associate with the implicit logic of koans, where I'm led back again and again to some kind of hyper-continuous and hyper-contradictory experience simultaneously over and over again until there's a soft explosion where everything is solved and I can't tell things apart. That's definitely one of my favorites. In particular, it's one of my favorites because when you go in, you can't be sure everything is solved and perfect, but you have no way of telling that that isn't the case at those points. For all I know, everything is perfectly complete and solved in that state. You just can't tell that it isn't. So those are two of my favorites, I guess.
What you're talking about, Layman, especially like the super extreme rock your world kind of states, reminds me of a lot of my early 20s psychedelic use. It can help you deconstruct your sense of self, but it kind of gives you a sort of stronger existential confidence, like you're saying, because you've been in that crazy place. You've you've kept your cool there, and you were able to keep your mind. I think a lot of people, they take psychedelic drugs and their idea of it is like, I'm going to let it take me where it wants to take me, kind of a thing. And that's not ever really been the way that I have approached it, at least not like waking state kind of psychedelic drugs like your LSDs and your mushrooms and things like that. I like that almost more as like a challenge of, am I going to be able to keep my shit together? And a lot of times I would even put myself in sort of extreme situations in those extreme states to sort of test myself and gain my strength and stuff. I don't really do that much anymore. I feel like almost even slightly more intimidated by it now that I'm a little bit older. Like, oh man, I don't know if I'm quite feeling ready to have my whole world shook today. If I'm really ready to take a good hard look in the mirror like that. I think now a lot more of my spiritual experience is mostly some kind of karma yoga or like some kind of a pagan self-creation kind of practice. And this is actually, I think, something that we don't talk about hardly at all, if ever, in the integral circles. It's very much about Buddhism and this kind of being practice. You don't really hear too much about the creative becoming. But this goes back to that, a different approach to even psychedelics too, of like whether you think that being conscious is about just sort of being here now and letting things flow and going with the flow versus being conscious as in consciously creating. So I think that's kind of a way that I do spiritual practice that I think is maybe different from some other people. Is I have a concept in my mind about my higher self and my attributes and characteristics of what that is. And I've been working on becoming that higher self through practice. And in my interactions with other people, I see it all as like an opportunity for spiritual practice. Like, this is a chance for me to live it and to be awesome and to be sympathetic and compassionate and to listen and to be God made flesh to this person, be that within the Buddhist tradition or the Christian tradition or the pagan tradition. To me, they all kind of start to overlap around certain ideas. I definitely include some practicing the power of now and mindfulness practices, and I use progressive relaxation techniques and stuff to go to sleep at night. So I'm incorporating stuff from a bunch of different traditions. I kind of feel like the ultimate goal of an integral spiritual practice is not to find some kind of like cookie cutter technique from each quadrant or something, but to make sure that you're touching each quadrant and that you have practices that work for you in your life in each quadrant. So that way you can really have a holistic perspective and approach.
So I've engaged in a lot of state training in many traditions for 20 years and continue to do so. It's always changing what practices work. One of the latest iterations is working with Irving First's sun practices. I find them very powerful, multidimensional. But I would actually say that my main practice right now is relationships. It's actually about incarnating and embodying in a much more effective, open, creative, kind way in my day-to-day relationships. Relationship has really become my primary practice at this point.
I really like that answer, by the way, about relationships. I think that's what's up.
For me, I think the most important and the most difficult thing that I do is just taking as many moments during the day as I can to stop and drop in to some sense of what all those other practices might reveal for me, the state practices. So I like Layman's word, soft explosion. So it's like trying to drop into that soft explosion of awareness and coherence that is available underneath everything else all the time, as far as I can tell. That feels like the main thing, or that's most important. And then I live in a very progressive part of the world, and I'm lucky to have a lot of opportunities and exposure to all kinds of things. So I get state experiences and state training in improvisational dance and breath work and sort of like group ritual stuff and group practices like circling and foam dialogue, experimentation with entheogens, Also, my contemplative practice focus these days is Dan Brown's emptiness meditation from the Indo-Tibetan tradition. So it feels like just a hodgepodge of all those things to kind of knock my states around, but it's sort of that daily practice of trying to let go and dip into whatever those other experiences reveal that seems most important.
I've never been associated with a lineage or a practice. I've had many, many, many different experiences throughout my life, beginning when I was 3 years old. And I've been kind of an explorer of what was going on. What I'm toying with right now is, could name a couple, neo-animism, which is the experience of seeing agency in omnidirection. So I'll talk about coffee moves hundreds of people every day, and how the natural world moves us instead of us moving the natural world, and what are the implications for that, to really kind of come to terms with us as being an equal participant in the natural world and not de-animating any part of the natural world. And when you walk around in that kind of state experience, then reality is certainly less anthropocentric. So just practicing that kind of neo-animism is one thing that I do. Also, I've been working a lot with perception and the limitations of perception, and trying to perceive without interpretive framework. So it's easy in nature, like to not perceive without interpretive frameworks, and then the animals come to you and all this kind of stuff happens, but also trying to do that when I'm with people and in workshops, and noticing how transformative an effect you can have when you are dialoguing without a lot of interpretive frameworks, and just kind of dealing with the perceptions and in a kind of non-judgmental way. So those are two kinds of different states of awareness, different views, I would call them, that I'm practicing with.
Well, I might throw a couple more in here, because it occurs to me listening to all of you that most of what I do isn't characterized by the types of states I gave examples of earlier. Like, most of what I consider to be my practice is a kind of blending practice. You know, in the talk I gave, I was trying to make a distinction between what I would call spirituality and mysticism, where mysticism focuses on states and spirituality might try to balance them out. That kind of balancing, whether it's between myself and another person, or a lot of the time between what seems like my conscious and unconscious mind, make up a big part of my regular practice now. Whether it's little kind of proprioceptive nuances in tracking the sensations of how another part of me is responding to information and trying to let it be a full participant, or whether it's sort of neo-shamanic practices in which there's a mild trance invocation, or I do a lot of hypnotherapy with people, and very similar kinds of processes in all of these things, where there's an attempt to not remove the ordinary conscious personality, but to have it operating roughly in parity with some other more decentralized seeming subjective intelligence system. And accompanying that is generally a diffuse sense of intensified beingness, which I prize above any particular state. Then in addition to that, there is something I like quite a bit, which is trying to bring intellect, emotion, and sensation online in approximately equal amounts at the same time. And that can be in perceiving things, trying to perceive my thoughts, feelings, and sensory perceptual experience of them in equal balance, or it can be just in checking those systems in myself. And that seems to create an intensified vividness that doesn't necessarily fall into one of the four states. That's really, it might lean a little bit toward the subtle, because I feel like that's one of the things that catalyzes the experience of a variety of subtle energy flow experiences, which I also do quite a bit of. Whatever the real significance of that, it's hard to say, but it certainly seems that holding roughly equivalent balancing of mental, emotional, and sensory whole field experience in the same moment creates the kind of conductivity that permits me to have seemingly subtle energy experiences.
I'm just noticing that as we're having this conversation, the globe, the world is having its own state transition. And so you can sort of see things getting darker in the background. I happen to be sitting outside. It's more of a contrast here, but you can see with everybody how the lighting has been shifting as the earth turns around us and changes its state.
But what strikes me as interesting when I hear us all describe the kinds of states that we like and the kind of practices that we do is that even if we're talking about trying to take a non-conceptual or preconceptual perspective, like a lot of what we're trying to do is rooted in these stories that we tell ourselves about how to think about what we're doing. It's really interesting, the kind of storytelling element that's around it. Like, I think that's what I think about even in the magic kind of tradition, the pagan tradition, is that a lot of it is like believing in things and willing them to be by telling stories and kind of casting spells. And maybe that's kind of what, Layman, you're talking about with these kind of koans and stuff like that, is like how to put yourself in a thought experiment that produces a particular kind of set of results.
Well, it does seem like if I think about a koan, for example, you take it apart, you put it back together, you go in at different angles and at different tempos. But one of the things you do is it is as if you're tracing a path over again and again and again, moving through a kind of a structure, which a story also is. And there's a kind of computational or algorithmic element to that. I think about the fractal, where you're going to run a particular pattern configuration and you don't necessarily get a result. But if you run that pattern configuration, the same style of pattern configuration enough times, all of a sudden you've got your beautiful, strange attractor for the fractal computation. So there's these things that might pop up through a story or through a structure that we use. If we go through it enough times the right way, then you get the bonus payoff.
Yeah, I make music and stuff too. So like one of the mantras that I've included into some of my music and that I've kind of sung to myself is this: all is impermanent, all is without a self. And so it's like you can say that in one way and it's like all is impermanent, all is without a self, and it's like freeing and it's beautiful. It's like an anthem. And then you could say it again in another way to yourself, and it's like all is impermanent, all is without a self. You know, you feel that impermanence and like the kind of pain and loss that goes with it. So it's like that kind of beautiful paradox of multiple entendres and multiple ways of feeling about like a particular idea from different perspectives, even within yourself. Kind of opens up this fun house mirror of the self to the self and how it all feels about itself.
I resonated with a lot of what all of you said, and I also have not remained anchored in a single tradition for a long time, but I have practiced fairly extensively within the Bonpo tradition, especially in Mother Tantra and Dzogchen traditions of the Bon lineage. I've done a lot of practice in time-space knowledge, or TSK. I've experimented with diamond approach. Actually, I did diamond approach work for about 5 years with a teacher, and that was a really good and generative period for me. Mostly, it's similar to what some of you have described in that it doesn't often show up these days in a formal sitting period, but more has to do with how I hold and relate to the whole constellation of my experience and work with that in different contexts throughout the day. So I like to live in inquiry and pursuing questions. Sometimes they're verbal questions, but sometimes they're just holding a mode of experience and awareness to see what else I can see there, to see what might be implicit within it or that might open up and shift. The steady practice I've had for a long time is just watching the movement of thought or the movement of consciousness and awareness and tracking that and going deeper with that. That's opened up for me some of my most powerful moments of decentralized, expanded, ecstatic awareness, where the whole body and worldscape seems transformed. And being a father now, watching my son approach the end of his school years, and family practice and relational practice is really important for me. And really working with my students. I don't often really think of them as students, but as people I'm engaging with in the university. There's a lot of really precious opportunity for heart engagement with people who are all deeply questioning and passionate about life and working towards their own betterment and transformation. It's really wonderful to just engage with people there. So I think that's it. Recently, in the last few years, with some of my writings in integral grammatology, somewhat along the lines of my TSK practice, sometimes I just look at the different grammatical philosophies as modes of ontological experience, and I experiment with combining them and shifting them and modulating them in different ways just to see what happens to my experiential field. That's related. I had a spiritual practice for a number of years, many years ago, of actually trying to of immerse myself in very alien languages just to see what shifted in my experience of the world as I learned to make sense of things from some pretty different presuppositional sets. So I'm not doing that now, but that same general exploratory sensibility is still there and still shows up in other contexts. So yeah, we're probably approaching an end here. And the last question I wanted to ask all of you is if you could corral our various shared insights and concerns and perspectives into a single luminous sphere, at least a momentarily appearing one, what would you do? What's your takeaway? What if we kind of shared together? What's the whole picture that you're emerging with at the end here? And does it suggest any avenues forward, any horizons that we may yet to explore?
Well, I'll start by seeing what I say. I felt really excited and hopeful about the ways that we intertwined and agreed, and also the ways that we diverged and in different creative ways. I felt good about the way we kind of fleshed out a space and feel like we were developing some foundational grounding. So that all feels good. And I also have a question in mind, which is what would it be like for us to work with different kinds of injunctions to set the stage for a certain kind of state experience, whether it's a koan or Bohm dialogue set of injunctions or something like that, and play with several of those and see what emerges from grounding in different states. So what emerges from the same group. That's just a fun imaginary that's floating through my mind right now.
I don't have a general summary. Feel like one could come, but I'm not really at that place yet. I like all of you. I feel like I could spend several hours going down this path with each of you, and then it could come back on the other side, maybe. More than a statement or a picture, I have the experience I've been going through for the last little while. I'm very tingly on my face and in my palms, and there's a very pleasant pressure up my spine, particularly just behind the bone of my nose is where it's the most intense. So that indicates to me there's something I like going on here, but it's not at the verbal or pictorial phase at the moment.
You see that? I knew it was your nose. Did you see that? I could feel that. So that's like some things that open up. Okay, this is all very new, and I don't think this conversation maybe existed behind closed doors in the past. It's online now. I think most of this kind of thing was hidden behind secret chambers for millennia. I think this is just the beginning, and I think the whole notion of states is going to be cracked wide open probably after most of us are dead. Maybe David's going to be still be an elder. He'll still be around. Yeah, so I think it's really exciting and something pioneering is happening. And I love the fact that it's becoming a much more open expression. Yeah, loving it.
I really like Tom's idea of us all coming up with some injunctions as thought experiments. And may I suggest that as a potential part 3 for this series, where we all think of a talk where we like come up with 3 or 4 different injunctions as suggestions or something like that. Maybe it could be a shorter video, but I like that idea because we've all come up with some good ideas of injunctions when we're talking about these practices. And I mean, like, I think even being a philosopher is like a particular kind of spiritual practice to like not make it personal, not take it personal, kind of die to your ego and just go after the truth. I'd be down to make this part 3 about injunctions if you guys would be down. In summation, I really enjoyed the talk. I guess I kind of wish we would have been able to take a little bit more time to dig in a little bit deeper to each other's perspectives as well. I mean, I got a list of questions here I wanted to ask people and didn't really get to it, but it was a really enjoyable talk with y'all. For example, Layman, Michael, and I all seem to agree that the different practices in different states were separate and you could be good at one but not the other. I would have liked to know if other people thought that was true as well. I don't know, but yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. I feel like it's bringing some benefit to the integral community, some much needed discussion around this, and hopefully if it will just get people starting to realize that there is still a diversity of perspectives around this stuff and that it's not just as simple as it might be presented, that Wilbur is kind of the first voice in this conversation conversation. It's up to us to take it up and to take it further and to refine it into the future and to argue about this stuff. That's what I'm talking about, philosophy as a spiritual practice. You know, it's a beautiful thing.
I don't know what happened in some summary way. There's so many directions, but it feels like something began to open up. And for myself, there's a sense of real connection and trust. For me, there's a real sense of trust amongst everybody here, with everybody. And so, yeah, something feels emergent, and I enjoyed being with everybody a lot. Really did. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. And I also feel something growing here, and hopefully we can continue to cultivate that in some way. So let's be in communication about that. But for now, thank you all for sharing so richly here. And I look forward to being able to go into this more deeply with you at some point in the future.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank everybody.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
You guys are great.
Thank you.